Some betrayals don't come with a warning. They don't arrive with a stranger's face, but instead hide behind familiar smiles, shared laughter, and the warmth of trust. On an ordinary day that promised nothing more than routine, one chilling truth unraveled, a truth that turned safety into danger and companionship into treachery. That was the day I realized the enemy was not outside, lurking in the shadows but sitting right beside me, watching, waiting, and hiding a secret I was never meant to discover. Zavian was never the kind of person you would suspect of hiding something dangerous. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a man who seemed to blend into every room without demanding attention, yet somehow always left a presence behind. His voice was calm, measured, the kind you could trust even when everything else around you was in chaos. For as long as I had known him, he had been the one to offer advice when my thoughts grew heavy, the one who stepped in with reassurance when doubt began to take over. People said he had a way of making you feel seen, as if your words mattered more to him than anyone else in the world. He listened with the kind of intensity that could steady a storm, and because of that I believed him. I believed in him, and that belief was the very thing that blinded me to what hid beneath the surface. When Zavian entered my life, he didn't force his way in, he simply appeared at the right moment. I was in a place where trust was scarce, where betrayal had already carved deep scars across my heart, and somehow he slipped past all the defenses I thought were unbreakable. He had this way of making loyalty seem effortless. He remembered the smallest details, the things most people forget within moments. If I mentioned an old book I used to love, weeks later he would bring it up again, as if he had carried the thought with him all that time. If I spoke of a memory from childhood, he would ask questions like he genuinely wanted to walk through it with me. That kind of attention is disarming, especially for someone who has known only distance and disappointment. It felt safe to lean into his presence, to believe I had finally found someone who understood me without judgment. But Zavian's calm exterior was not just kindness, it was control. Looking back now, I can see how subtle it was, the way he guided conversations, the way he always seemed to be exactly what I needed in the moment.
If I was angry, he was patient.
If I was broken, he was gentle. If I was too hopeful, he was cautious, pulling me back just enough to keep me tethered. At the time, it felt like balance, like he was the anchor I needed to stop drifting into dangerous waters. What I did not realize was that anchors can also hold you down, drag you into places you cannot escape from once you start to sink. There were moments, faint and fleeting, when something about him seemed out of place. Sometimes his eyes would linger too long, not with warmth but with calculation, as if measuring every word that came from my mouth. Sometimes his silence was not comforting but heavy, like he was storing away information I did not even know I was giving him. I would catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression blank, unreadable, and yet I always pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself I was imagining it. After all, how could suspicion live in the same space as trust? How could I even begin to doubt the one person who had given me no reason to doubt at all? The truth is, Zavian understood me better than I understood myself, and that was both the gift and the danger. He knew my strengths, but more importantly, he knew my weaknesses. He knew the cracks in my armor, the fears I buried, the insecurities I never voiced aloud to anyone else. To me, it felt like intimacy, the kind of connection people search for their entire lives. To him, it was ammunition, waiting for the right moment. I can still remember the way his voice sounded when he spoke my name, calm and steady, as if he had already rehearsed every word he ever said to me. That voice had the power to silence the alarms ringing faintly at the edges of my mind, lulling me into a trust so deep I could not see the danger growing right beside me. There were days when his loyalty felt almost too perfect, like a story crafted too carefully to be real. He never slipped, never faltered, never contradicted himself. If I questioned something, he always had an answer ready, smooth and believable. If I hesitated, he reassured me with a look that seemed unshakable. That kind of flawlessness should have been the first warning, because real people are not perfect. Real people stumble, forget, make mistakes. But Zavian seemed to exist outside of that, untouchable in his ability to adapt. I told myself it was just who he was, that some people are simply built differently. In reality, it was the mask he wore, crafted carefully over time. A mask designed to make me trust him so fully that when the truth finally surfaced, it would be far too late. And yet in all of this, I cannot deny the comfort he gave me in the moments I needed it most. That is what makes the memory of him so haunting. Because even knowing what I know now, I cannot erase the feeling of safety he created. Safety that was never real, but felt more genuine than anything I had ever experienced before. He was the calm in my storm, the steady hand I thought I could hold on to without fear. But beneath that calm, beneath the silence and the patience, something darker was waiting. Something I was too blind to see, too trusting to confront, too hopeful to imagine could exist in the person sitting right beside me. Subtle signs of deception surface in small, unexplainable actions. At first they were easy to dismiss, little moments that felt too insignificant to hold any weight. But when pieced together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. There were times when Zavian's phone would light up in the middle of our conversations, and though his eyes would flicker toward the screen, he never picked it up in front of me. He would let the call end, silence stretching in the air, before excusing himself moments later with some vague explanation that never quite added up. I told myself it was nothing, that everyone has their private matters, but deep down, a seed of doubt began to take root. Then there were the slips of memory, subtle contradictions in his stories. One day he would say he had never been to a particular place, and another day he would casually describe the layout as if he had walked its halls countless times. He would laugh off the inconsistency, brushing it aside with a charm that made me feel foolish for even questioning him. But the human mind remembers these things, holds on to them even when the heart tries to excuse them, and slowly, I began to notice more. It was also in the way he studied people, not casually but intently, as if cataloging every gesture, every word, every weakness he could later draw upon. When he spoke to strangers, his tone shifted, becoming softer, friendlier, almost too perfect, like he was wearing a costume that suited whatever role was needed in that moment. He was adaptive, always fitting himself to the environment like water in a container. But when I caught him watching after, his face returned to that same blank expression, empty and cold. Objects began to go missing too, not in ways that screamed theft, but in quiet vanishings that left me uneasy. A note I had written for myself, a small trinket I kept on the table, even a photo I thought I had placed carefully. All gone without explanation. When I asked about them, Zavian would tilt his head, give me that calm smile, and tell me I must have misplaced them. His voice was so steady, so sure, that I almost believed I was losing my mind. The most unsettling moments, though, were the silences. He would sometimes fall quiet in the middle of our conversations, his eyes fixed on me like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to say words I hadn't yet spoken, waiting for me to reveal more than I intended. And when I finally asked what he was thinking, he would shake his head, smile faintly, and say, "Nothing." But it was not nothing. It was never nothing. It was the weight of secrets pressing against the surface. Secrets he guarded with the same calmness that once made me trust him. Those small things, the missed calls, the contradictions, the vanishings, the silences, they were fragments of a puzzle I hadn't yet begun to assemble. On their own, they seemed harmless, the kind of things anyone could explain away. But together, they whispered a truth that chilled me. Zavian was not who he claimed to be, and the cracks in his mask were beginning to show. A shocking revelation hints at a hidden agenda, and it came not with an explosion of truth, but in the kind of quiet discovery that leaves your skin crawling. It started with something so small I almost ignored it, a folded piece of paper that slipped from Zavian's jacket when he hung it on the chair. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a shopping list or some note he had written to himself, but when I unfolded it, the words written inside were not casual reminders. They were names, familiar names, people I knew, people I trusted, and even my own name sat there among them like a wound carved into the page. Each name was followed by symbols, strange markings I couldn't understand, but the precision with which they were written told me this was not meaningless scribble. This was something deliberate. My chest tightened as I read it again and again, my hands trembling at the thought of what it could mean. When I confronted Zavian about it, I expected surprise, maybe anger at my intrusion, but he only smiled faintly and plucked the paper from my hands as though it were of no importance. "Just old notes," he said, folding it neatly and slipping it back into his pocket. His calmness should have reassured me, but instead it hollowed me out, because no one defends something meaningless with such careful control. Not long after, the cracks widened. I overheard a phone call he didn't mean for me to catch. His voice was lower, harsher than I had ever heard it, stripped of the gentle tone he always used with me. He spoke in fragments, quick and sharp, as though exchanging instructions rather than conversation. The words weren't all clear, but I caught enough to chill my blood. Phrases like, "he doesn't know yet," and "waiting for the right time." My heart pounded as I pressed myself against the wall, praying he wouldn't notice I was listening. When he ended the call, his voice softened instantly, and he returned to me with that same calm presence, as if the man I had just heard on the phone did not exist. From that day forward, I began to see him differently. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried the possibility of hidden intent. I replayed our past conversations in my mind, searching for signs I had missed, wondering how long he had been weaving this web around me. The realization was unbearable. The comfort he gave me, the trust I placed in him, had all been carefully cultivated. He had been preparing me, shaping me, guiding me towards something I could not yet see. The shocking part was not just that he had secrets, it was that those secrets were tied to me. I was not a bystander in whatever game he was playing. I was a piece of it, maybe even the target. The late-night calls, the vanishing objects, the names on that paper, everything pointed to an agenda far larger than I could understand. And for the first time, I wondered if I had been living beside my greatest threat all along. Suspicion grew like mold in a damp room, slow at first, almost invisible, then spreading across every thought until it stained everything I touched. It started as an ache behind my ribs, a tiny tremor in the middle of the night that left me listening for noises that weren't there. Trust had been a warm coat I wore without thinking, but suddenly the seams began to unravel in places I hadn't noticed. Each new scrap of evidence landed like a pinprick, and with every prick the coat loosened, exposing skin that had been protected for so long it now smarted with cold and fear. At first, I tried to explain it away. People make mistakes, memories blur, coincidences happen. But the coincidences kept lining up like coins in a row, too many to be chance. There was the photograph tucked into a book on my shelf that showed Zavian in a place he'd always denied visiting. There was the small black USB found behind the back of his jacket when I was straightening up one afternoon, the kind of object that didn't belong to someone who had nothing to hide. I found receipts for purchases made at hours he'd claimed to be home asleep. I found names written in the margins of a used notebook, the same strange symbols I'd seen before. And beneath one of them, in a hurried scrawl, the word I couldn't stop staring at: vulnerable. Every new discovery sharpened my instincts until suspicion was no longer an abstract feeling, but a living, breathing thing that followed me. It invaded the space between us, a presence that made casual touches feel like tests and whispered reassurances sound like rehearsed lines. When Zavian laughed now, it felt staged. When he reached for my hand, an electric jolt ran through me that was equal parts longing and dread. I wanted to believe him. I wanted fiercely to be wrong, but the evidence kept arriving, each piece heavier than the last. I started cataloging them in my head like a detective who didn't want to accept the crime, the missed calls, the inconsistent stories, the hidden notes, the strange bank transfers. It was meticulous work, and it made me feel obscene, like I was dissecting the person I had loved. It wasn't just physical evidence. It was the way people around us began to shift when I mentioned anything at all. Friends who once trusted him offered thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A colleague who used to speak to me freely now skirted around certain subjects, their sentences unfinished as if they shared a secret I wasn't allowed to know. Once, at a small gathering, someone leaned in under the guise of conversation and said, "Be careful," with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I felt like I'd been given a map drawn in invisible ink, markers that appeared only when you looked for them and vanished the moment you tried to point them out. Paranoia is a treacherous cave. Once you step inside, the walls echo everything you fear. I began testing him, not with accusations but with small experiments that felt both childish and necessary. I mentioned a name I'd seen in a scribble and watched his reaction. He smiled and redirected the conversation. I asked about a place he'd denied visiting and noted the micro-expression, an almost imperceptible tensing of his jaw. I left my phone unlocked on the table one night and pretended to be asleep, listening to the soft rustle of him moving around the apartment. When he finally left the room, I checked the call log and found an entry I hadn't expected. A short call to a number labeled only in my mind as dangerous. The more I checked, the more the world rearranged itself to fit the new narrative. Memories I had once taken for granted reinterpreted themselves, an offhand remark, a strangely timed absence, the way he always seemed to know more about certain people than he should. Trust and evidence collided in my head like tectonic plates, and the ground shifted beneath me. I felt unmoored, as though the life I had built on the assumption of honesty was suddenly a house of cards. Friends told me to take a breath, to not jump to conclusions. Strangers offered their own horror stories like warnings. but no one could give me certainty. All I had were fragments, and fragments can be cruelly persuasive when lined up in a row. At night, my dreams became a carousel of possibilities. Him leaving, him betraying, him pleading. Sleep offered no respite. It only rearranged my anxieties into new shapes. During the day, I moved through the world with a narrowed focus, noticing details I'd previously ignored. The smell of his cologne that didn't quite match the brand he claimed to use. The song on his playlist that referenced places he'd never admit visiting. The way his shoes were sometimes damp even when the forecast promised sun. Little things multiplied into a pattern that formed a picture I wasn't ready to see. And yet, amid the rising evidence, he remained astonishingly ordinary. He still made coffee in the morning, still remembered the small things that had once made my heart ache with gratitude. He could be tender, thoughtful, devastatingly present in ways that felt impossibly sincere. That duality was the cruelest part. How could one person be both the source of warmth and the architect of cold? It made every instinct war with itself, love battling logic, memory against observation. I wanted proof that would silence the doubt entirely, an incontrovertible moment that would either free me to trust again or give me the permission to walk away. But life rarely offers those tidy conclusions. Instead, it hands you half-truths and dangerous silences and asks you to choose. The choice hovered over me like a storm cloud. If I confronted him without enough proof, I risked destroying relationships and handing him the moral high ground. If I waited for more, I risked becoming complicit in my own harm. Each path felt like an abyss with its own brand of pain. So I watched, I gathered, I listened, and with every piece of chilling evidence that met my stubborn need to believe, suspicion grew not into certainty but into an urgent, aching readiness, an awareness that when the moment of truth came, nothing would ever be the same. A confrontation unravels the mask Zavian has worn all along, and it begins not with rage or chaos, but with a single question that I could no longer keep inside. The silence between us had grown unbearable, thick with everything unsaid, and when I finally spoke, my voice trembled more from the weight of truth than fear. "Who are you, really?" I asked, and for the first time since I had known him, his calm expression faltered. It wasn't much, just the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, the brief flicker of something sharp in his eyes, but it was enough to confirm what I had been dreading all along. The room seemed to shrink around us. Every detail I had collected, every inconsistency, every scrap of evidence pressed in on me, demanding resolution. I laid them out piece by piece. The names on the paper, the phone calls whispered in the dark, the receipts, the missing objects, the symbols I still didn't understand. I expected denial, perhaps laughter, maybe even outrage. Instead, Zavian listened in silence, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his posture too composed for someone under fire. The quiet stretched until it felt unbearable, and then, with a breath that sounded almost like relief, he said, "You weren't supposed to find out this way." The words cut deeper than any denial could have. They weren't a rejection of my suspicions, they were confirmation. His voice no longer carried the soothing steadiness I had grown used to. It was harder now, stripped of pretense, weighted with something colder. He leaned back, watching me with eyes that no longer pretended softness. "You've always been sharper than you let yourself believe," he added, as though it were a compliment, but there was no warmth in it. I pressed him for answers, demanded to know what the notes meant, who he was speaking to, what role I played in this game I hadn't agreed to. For the first time, Zavian didn't try to soften his words or disguise his intentions. He spoke of plans, of information, of a purpose that stretched beyond the walls of our relationship. He didn't give me all the details, just enough to show me the truth I had been avoiding. Everything I thought I knew about him was carefully constructed, a mask he had worn for as long as we had been together. The loyalty, the tenderness, the comfort, all of it was part of a design. What stunned me most was not his confession, but the ease with which he shed the mask. One moment he was the man I had trusted, and the next he was someone else entirely, someone colder, sharper, unrecognizable. It was like watching a stranger step out of a familiar body. His voice no longer bent to reassurance. It carried a command, an authority that made the hairs on my neck rise. The calm I had once loved was now revealed as control, and every memory I had with him rearranged itself in my mind, painted with the colors of manipulation. Anger surged in me, tangled with grief, but beneath it all was the deepest cut of betrayal. He had known me better than anyone, and he had used that knowledge as a weapon. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of it. He gave me a long, measured look as though deciding how much truth I could handle. "Because you let me in," he said simply. And in that moment, I realized the cruelest part of it all, that the very qualities I had thought made our bond unbreakable were the same ones he had exploited to get this close. The confrontation did not end with shouting, nor with violence, but with an unmasking so complete that it left no illusions behind. The Zavian I had known was gone, stripped away by his own words, and what remained was a man I never truly knew at all. The enemy I had feared was not a shadow lurking outside, but the figure who had sat beside me all along, hiding behind loyalty and love, waiting for the moment when the mask could finally come off. The narrator faces the haunting choice between survival and betrayal, and it arrives like a blade pressed quietly against the skin. No warning, no time to prepare. In the stillness that followed Zavian's confession, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every truth he had hidden now hung between us like a noose, and I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. Staying meant surrendering to whatever plan he had been weaving, and leaving meant becoming a target. Trust was gone. Love was gone. All that remained was the raw question of survival. Zavian's eyes followed me with unsettling calm, as though he had already calculated every move I might make. "You can walk away," he said, his tone unnervingly casual, "but you won't get far. They'll come for you. I can keep you safe if you stay." His words were delivered like an offer, but they felt like a trap. To stay was to give myself over to the man who had built his life on deception. To leave was to risk stepping into the unknown, hunted by forces I couldn't even name. The choice clawed at me, tearing through every memory we had shared. The warmth of his voice, the nights of laughter, the quiet comfort I once thought unshakable. They all screamed at me to remember the man I believed he was. But beneath it, another voice rose louder. The memory of lies, the names written on paper, the silence that had masked secrets, the truth that had stripped him bare. Love could no longer shield me. The air was heavy with the weight of decision. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, reality bending under the pressure of two unbearable paths. If I betrayed him, I betrayed the bond we had built, even if it had been a lie. If I chose survival, I condemned the part of me that had once trusted him with everything. Either way, something would be lost forever. In that moment, survival was no longer about the body. It was about the soul. Could I live with myself if I stayed and became complicit in his deception? Could I live with myself if I left and carried the scar of loving an enemy I never saw coming? The answer pressed down like iron, cold and merciless, demanding a choice that would define not just the end of this story, but the rest of my life.